Let's get started. Welcome everyone and good afternoon. This is Ann Kuppinger again from the Technical Assistance Center. And I'm really pleased that you've all joined us today for a webinar entitled Bullying and Emotional Vulnerability. I'll say a few words about our presenter in a minute, but she's Jennifer Sibley, who is the Family Support Services Program Director at the Northern Regional Center for Independent Living, or NERCL. So we're really glad you're here today. As I mentioned, you've all been joined into the webinar in listen-only mode. We have quite a few people registered for today, but we do want to hear from you. So we really invite you throughout the webinar to use the chat function. And you can open that up. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a speech bubble that says chat. If you click on that, the chat box should open to the right side of your screen. And you can chat to all of the folks that are on the webinar today. And we will also be collecting any questions that you have so that we can answer those questions at the end. We've left some time for Q&A at the end of this webinar. And we have found that to be really useful, that folks have a lot of questions and we don't have to rush you off. So I see everybody's already starting to chat in. Their name, the agency that they're with, what your role is there, and where you're located. And I see all different kinds of folks. You know, we set this webinar series up for family and youth peer advocates, but we are so delighted that so many of you are here. This is certainly an important topic, and you know, lots of folks are interested, and we're really glad that you've joined us today for that. While you're chatting in your information, I just want to introduce our presenter, Jennifer Sibley, and she, as I said, is the Family Support Services Program Director and a credentialed family peer advocate at NERCL in Watertown, New York. She's been working with families of children with disabilities for over 13 years. In her time as a family peer advocate, she has supported military families as the Fort Drum Family Peer Advocate, and has worked under the U.S. Department of Education grant as a parent training and education coordinator to provide advocacy and parent and community training in the northern 10 counties of New York State. Her lived experience and her greatest joy comes from her two boys, Wyatt, who is 18 and has autism, and Tyler, who is 4 and is neurotypical, but a bundle of endless energy. We've had the pleasure of Tyler's company on some of our planning calls, and he's delightful. So before we get started, I just want to kind of orient everyone to where we are in this series. We started this series back in June and July of 2021 with 3 webinars. And when you get these slides later on, you'll find the link to those original webinars in the slides, so you'll be able to locate those. And it was so popular and people had so many questions and they identified other key topics that we planned a part 2 of the series. So last week, Jen Schwartz, who's joining us today as one of our panelists, did a wonderful webinar on supporting students with mental health needs. Today, we're doing this webinar on bullying and emotional vulnerability. And in early March, Kara Giorgi from Starbridge is going to do a webinar on functional behavioral assessments and behavioral intervention plans. I want to add that also on the webinar today, we have Rosalia Watkins from Vibrant Emotional Health, who is a wonderful, knowledgeable expert on education issues. And we are also joined by our co-planners and coordinators of this series, Families Together in New York State. And we have Susan Berger and Mona Ganame on. So lots of folks here, and without any more introduction, I think I'll hand it over to Jen.
Hi, Ann, and hi everyone for being here. Thank you so much for attending today. I'm honored to be asked to present. So I appreciate everyone's time and being here with us today. There's a lot to cover when we're talking about bullying and emotional vulnerability. So I kind of wanted to start off by breaking it down into what is our purpose for today. So in the time that we have today, I'd like to first take a look at an overview of the nature and the prevalence of bullying. So we're going to take a look at what the definition of bullying is and what types of bullying are occurring. We're also going to be talking about if there's any differences between gender, age of children who are bullies or bullying, and what the observations are in those different scenarios. Second, we're going to discuss why we should be concerned about bullying among children and youth. We're going to explore the emotional and the social impact of bullying, not just on the victims of bullying, but also on the bully themselves and bystanders. So we're going to be talking about the 3 Bs. Third, I'd like to give you an overview of some of the ways that schools are currently addressing bullying and talk to you about what the roles and responsibilities are of everyone involved in the process. We're going to give an overview of the Dignity for All Students Act, which I'm going to refer by the acronym DASA. And recently there was an amendment to DASA called Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair, or the Crown Act. So we will be touching on both of those pieces of legislation a little later on in the presentation. We're going to talk about what strategies are most effective in preventing bullying and intervening to stop bullying, and most importantly, what strategies are not as effective. And finally, we're going to talk about ways that New York State and school districts are working to reduce bullying in schools. So I thought I'd start off by giving you guys some statistics. And I think it's important to know what the stats are on bullying because it's such a hidden problem. And schools don't like to acknowledge that bullying happens in their schools. And when it does happen, it's usually something that takes a lot of people by surprise. So it's actually more common than people think. 20% of students in schools report having been bullied at some point in their school career. Male students report being physically bullied more than female students, about 6% versus 4%. Female students report being twice as likely as male students to experience rumors or exclusion, so more of an indirect type of bullying. So about 18% versus 9% of female students versus male students. And 46% of students say that they reported being bullied to an adult. What that statistic doesn't tell us is what happened after reporting that bullying. But I was surprised at the number of 46% of students say that they report it. Some more statistics to look at. 1 in 5 students have experienced cyberbullying, which we will touch on in a little bit more detail later on. The reasons for being bullied reported most often by students include physical appearance, race and ethnicity, gender, disability, religion, and sexual orientation. And school-based bullying prevention programs decrease bullying by up to 25%. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the main characteristics of bullying. So when people are talking about bullying as a specific issue within school districts, they're talking about 3 main identifying factors. That is the intent to cause harm, that it occurs over time, and it creates this differential of power over someone. So researchers and practitioners generally agree that bullying has these 3 defining characteristics. Bullying is aggressive behavior that tends to cause harm or distress. It's not an isolated act of carelessness. And I think when we're working with parents, both as family peer advocates and as youth peer advocates, or what other professional role we're working with families in, we need to keep that in mind, that there's a very distinct difference between an act of bullying and an act of children just trying to learn how to develop those social skills. So it's important to foster those conversations. And again, we will get into a little bit more about the difference between fostering positive social skills and bullying in a little bit more detail. Bullying is oftentimes intentional, and the bully has a purpose for targeting that particular person. And again, it's not to be confused with poor social skills. So one of the things that we often hear, especially in elementary school age children, is that, well, he likes you, he just doesn't know how to tell you, so he's being mean to you. How many times have we heard that told to some of our students? So again, it's very intentional, this act of bullying against another student. Bullying happens over time. It's very rare that a bullying incident is a one and done. It does happen occasionally that a student is targeted over a specific thing and it's a one-time incident. However, a lot of times bullying does happen over time. It can be a confusing concept for parents because some children are aggressive and they target other people for reasons that happen more than once. And for a parent, there sometimes doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason as to why their child is being targeted. So it does take some investigation from school officials, from other people involved with the particular situation to try to figure out what is the intent behind it. Bullying occurs in a relationship where there is usually an imbalance of power somehow, whether that's an actual imbalance of power, meaning that someone is physically stronger than another person, or whether that's a perceived imbalance of power. So somebody feels like another person is weaker than them over a perceived characteristic of some sort. So children who bully tend to choose targets that they perceive to be weaker or less than in one way or another. And often this perception is skewed by other factors, such as bias, cultural beliefs, socioeconomic status, or other things going on within the environment. And this perceived imbalance creates this idea that the bully has power over someone. So it's important to note that bullying is a form of victimization or peer abuse, and it shares some characteristics with other forms of victimization, such as domestic violence and child maltreatment. And it's also important to consider what bullying isn't. Bullying is not a form of conflict, which implies that there's two parties that are more or less on equal footing. So there are some school districts that try to create this conflict resolution theory to bullying strategies to address these issues within their school. And we'll talk about why this strategy isn't as effective for dealing with bullying within schools. So there's several different types of bullying. There's physical aggression, which most of us are pretty familiar with. Physical aggression is, hitting, punching, kicking, actually laying physical hands or a physical body part on another person's physical being. There's verbal bullying. Verbal bullying is name calling, saying things that are derogatory in nature to another person. There's indirect bullying. Indirect bullying is things like starting rumors or saying things that you know are not necessarily true about another person in order to create a conflict with another person. And then, of course, there's cyberbullying. And cyberbullying includes both direct and indirect forms of bullying, where a person is directly targeted or rumors are spread online about another person. Also, with indirect bullying, a person can be purposely excluded from partaking in an activity. So, for instance, they're not allowed to enter into a group chat because they're perceived as being less than, or, oh, I don't want that person being part of our group. There's also different forms of cyberbullying, and because cyberbullying is so pervasive, we will touch on that specifically in a few minutes. I know I keep saying that we're going to touch on things specifically, but I promise this is all going to come together. So when we think of bullying, a lot of people tend to sort bullying into the 3 Bs. Bullying's 3 Bs are the bully, the bullied, and the bystander. So in order to really understand the 3 Bs, we're going to start off by talking about the bully. And there are a number of different factors that we need to look at when we're talking about people who bully another person. So there are peer factors. Bullies tend to target other people for a number of peer factors, whether that's to attain or maintain a peer status, meaning that they're looking for some sort of social capital to be gained or maintained by bullying another person. Or they could be looking to fit in with a peer group. So they're looking to gain some social status from that. They could exclude others from a peer group because they feel like if they can exclude another person from joining within that peer group, then they're, again, gaining that social status or that peer status from another group. And they could be looking to gain control over another person for whatever reason that would be. Bullies also tend to have some family factors involved with their home life. So a lot of times bullies tend to also be victims of violence and bullying at home from either caregivers or other family members. A lot of times bullies also lack emotional support from caregivers and others within their home. And again, this is just a generalization. Not every person who is a bully experiences all of these factors, but these are just some of the contributing factors to why a person becomes a bully. A lot of bullies also tend to come from a background of an authoritarian style of parenting or caregiving, meaning that the person who's providing care for them or providing, that parental role for them is much more of a dictator and much more like do it and do it now kind of thing versus a gentle or a nurturing type of approach. And again, one of the common factors we see in these family situations is that there's little structure or consequences for any kind of negative behavior for things that happen within the family home. Some of the emotional factors that tend to come into play with people who are bullies are, again, they tend to be past victims of bullying. Whether that's from other family members or from another peer who they've experienced bullying from. Bullies also tend to have lower levels of insecurity and self-esteem. And they also tend to have a lower threshold of emotional control and emotional understanding of other people. And for the most part, bullies also tend to have lower positive social skills. They have a harder time being able to interact with other people, usually again because they have poor role models within their lives. And then there's the school factors that go into why people bully others. There's behavioral and bullying issues that are not properly addressed within the school setting. And they have experienced for themselves exclusion, a lack of acceptance, or being stigmatized by other people. One of the websites that I will share with you all at the end as a resource is stopbullying.gov. It's really what the schools use for their go-to resource for bullying information. So I encourage you to check out that website when you get a chance to look at some of the statistics and some of the articles that they have on bullying and bullies, kids who are bullied, and bystanders. There's a really wealth of information there. So for people who are bullies, there's as of course what we would think of as some long-term consequences. So 60% of boys who were bullies in middle school had at least one conviction through the court system by the age of 24. And 40% of those boys had 3 or more convictions. Bullies are also 4 times more likely as peers to have multiple convictions. Other behavioral factors and long-term consequences that go into people who are bullies to other students are some poor social adjustment as they become adults, some long-term behavioral problems, multiple court convictions and jail time. They commit more serious crimes, particularly as the offenses start to rack up. They tend to have more driving offenses and more incidences of drunk driving, higher incidences of alcoholism and mental health problems. And as they get older, they tend to have more and more school problems. Some other features to keep in mind is that bullies tend to be either a single child or a small group. Bullies don't tend to take into that large group mentality. They tend to be either one person or a small group of 2 or 3 children. Bullying oftentimes happens most commonly in school versus on the way to or from school, which is surprising to me because oftentimes adults are present when this bullying is occurring, but these adults tend to have no knowledge that the bullying is actually happening right in front of them, and which to me kind of blows my mind because a lot of times adults are actually seeing these things occurring, but they're not connecting it that this is an actual bullying incident that's taking place. Some of the common places that bullying takes place, and for those who cannot see the slides, there's some pictures on the slide of a playground, a school cafeteria, a school bus, a hallway in a school with some lockers, and a school bathroom. These are the most common places where bullying takes place within a school building. And it happens in these locations because there tends to be not a lot of adult supervision, or if the adults are supervising in these settings, the adults tend to be a little bit more distracted by what's going on in those settings. So it's easier to kind of hide what's going on. All right. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to chat those in. I know we're going to have some opportunities at the end of this presentation to answer questions. So with that, we're going to move on to the second B, which is the bullied. So common targets of bullies or kids who are bullied are kids who are seen as vulnerable in some way, whether that's because they have a disability, because they are seen as physically weaker than the person who is bullying, or some other perceived difference. They are seen by whoever is targeting them as somehow vulnerable. Kids who are bullied are also tend to be less socially popular than their peers. And this is actually an easy way for them to become targets because they're not as likely to have someone who would be able to stand up for them or stand up with them. And again, they are common targets because they have something about them that's perceived as being different, whether that's race, culture, sexual orientation, disability, etc., whatever that protected class may be, or whatever that perceived difference might be. So on the slide, there is a picture of a child laying in bed with an alarm clock next to them. And there's all kinds of words floating around this little guy. And these words are things that affect students who are being bullied. So it's things like anxiety, lower academic success. They have poor peer situations at school. Kids who are bullied also suffer from lower self-esteem and higher rates of insecurity. So bullying often seriously affects the psychosocial functioning and the academic work of kids who are being targeted. Bullying victimization has been found to be related to lower self-esteem and higher rates of depression, loneliness, and clinical anxiety for youth. Victims of bullying also report being more likely to want to avoid attending school, and they have higher rates of school absenteeism. Some of the health consequences of bullying for students who are bullied versus being not bullied. I'm not going to read all of the numbers and statistics to you, but you can see from the slide that they do have some higher rates across the board of students who are bullied versus being not bullied. So they have higher rates of headaches, sleep problems, abdominal pain, feeling tense, feelings of anxiety, feeling unhappy. And when they are scored on the depression scale, they have higher rates of feeling moderate depression and a strong indication of feeling depression. The last B that we're going to talk about is bystanders. And I found this quote from the stopbullying.gov website. And the quote is, "Bystanders are the supporting cast. They may not initiate the bullying, they may join in, or they may just stand by and let it happen." And I feel like supporting cast is a perfect description of a bystander to bullying, because a lot of times, whether they're actually contributing to the incident happening or not, they are the supporting cast. They're supporting it in some way or another, whether they're viewing it happening or they're joining in actively. And the picture that's on the slide is just a large group of children and adults being held back by a barrier. So cyberbullying is something else that we need to talk about in more detail. So cyberbullying occurs on digital devices through various mediums, such as texting, social media, different downloadable apps, either on your computer or on your cell phone, through different social media and other forums, or more commonly now on gaming platforms. This includes sending, posting, or sharing negative, harmful, false, or mean content about another person. And there are special concerns about cyberbullying that it can be permanent, hard to detect, and very persistent. And this is especially true for some of these newer social media apps, such as TikTok, because they are anonymous and it's very hard to detect who's actually posting the content. And it's very easy to take this content down. So once it's detected, it can be taken down, and without a record of it actually occurring, it's very hard to say, yes, it's actually happened, or no, it didn't happen. So the image on the screen to go with this slide is a little boy who is sitting on the floor crying, and there's a computer screen open in front of him with a lot of derogatory terms pasted across the computer screen. So people who witness or experience cyberbullying tend to be more fearful. They experience guilt because they are a witness to it. They have higher incidences of anxiety, and they oftentimes will experience lower school success because of the sense of guilt and helplessness that comes along with viewing cyberbullying. And this is an image of students walking down a hallway with looks of concern on their face. So there are some distinct differences between bullying and cyberbullying. Oftentimes bullying tends to be a lot more direct versus cyberbullying, which tends to be a little bit more anonymous. Cyberbullying is, again, much harder to detect, and it's easier to have your name not as connected to the incidences that happen. Bullying in and of itself oftentimes occurs on school property, whereas cyberbullying tends to happen more often off of school property, but it has a direct correlation to things that are happening within the school environment. Bullying, oftentimes bullies have a more poor relationship with teachers and staff within the school. But conversely, kids who engage in cyberbullying oftentimes report having good relationships with teachers. And when incidences of cyberbullying are reported and a student is found to be the perpetrator of cyberbullying, teachers will often report that they never thought in a million years that this particular child would be the one that started this incident. Bullying sometimes contributes to a fear of retribution from staff, whereas cyberbullying will sometimes contribute to a fear of loss of technology privileges. Now that we've talked about the what and the wheres and the hows, we're going to talk a little bit more about what schools are doing. So schools are required under various regulations in New York State to figure out some ways to raise awareness of bullying efforts. There is a number of different things that schools are required to do to report and to track bullying incidences. Every school district has a bullying or a DASA, Dignity for All Students Act coordinator, who is in charge of investigating and deciding whether an incident meets the level of a material incident for reporting. A lot of times schools will engage in social skills training for victims of bullying, as well as for the students who are bullies. Schools will oftentimes as well engage students who bully or who are bullied in individual and group treatment, as well as some mediation and conflict resolution programs. And there is a big push now in New York State and across the country for curricular approaches to bullying prevention. So that's actually providing curriculum programs taught within the classroom settings on preventing bullying. And if you see something, say something, those kinds of approaches to dealing with bullying. And then there's some more comprehensive approaches that are more of a nationwide approach that have been adopted by various school districts. So really, ultimately, what works in bullying prevention is reducing bullying in schools is nothing less than a change in the school climate and in norms for behavior. This requires a comprehensive school-wide effort involving the entire school community. So the reason I bring this slide up and the reason that I state this so specifically is that for a lot of schools, they feel like having a bullying curriculum is enough to prevent school bullying. And really, it's not enough. And as parents of kids who tend to be emotionally vulnerable because of a difference, we know that this is not enough. It really does require that schools change their entire mindset and really push to change their school climate and change what they accept as norms for behavior. This has to be adopted as a school-wide mindset. It's not enough to say, hey, kids, when you see something, say something, if the building administration is not willing to act on those things when they happen. So knowing this, what can we do? Well, we already know what doesn't work. Some schools say, hey, let's have an assembly. Let's have a guest speaker come in and talk to our students about why bullying is bad. Well, that's great. And it's a great opportunity to share information with students about why bullying is bad and what the harmful effects of bullying are on a person who has experienced it. The problem with this approach is that when there is no follow-up and there's no curriculum or there's no program to back that up, it's a one and done. Kids get exposure to it. They see it happen. They're like, oh, that's so sad. That really happened to that poor person. But then nothing comes of it. So a simple assembly won't do. You have to put more meat to the bones. A zero tolerance approach to bullying often backfires on schools as well. And the reason zero tolerance often backfires is because no two cases of bullying are exactly the same. One incidence of bullying where a student calls another person a name may be as retaliation because another student called them something. So having a zero tolerance policy often creates a more hostile situation, and it pushes bullying under the carpet, and it makes it so that people who tend to want to bully other people find sneakier ways to be able to get away with that behavior because they know that if they're caught, there's going to be some consequences for it. I hate the idea of making the bully and the victim talk it out, because what's worse than seeing the person on a daily basis who is tormenting you, that you just talked to your teacher and said, this person makes my life a living hell. Now you have to sit down and you have to talk to that person about why they're doing this to you and how they make you feel. It's not doing anything but validating to the bully that they've created this power over situation, and it's making the victim re-victimized by all of the things that have happened to them. And in the end, without actually addressing the issue and creating change and making something happen from that situation, nothing changes. You're creating the same situation. Your environment is still the same. You're putting those two children back in the same scenarios every day. It's not changing anything. And group therapy sessions are great if you're also putting those as part of a school-wide implementation program. Group therapy sessions in and of themselves for people who are bullies doesn't work, and oftentimes will backfire on school districts because you're putting groups of people together who already have a tendency to be aggressive, to want to target people who they feel are less than them. And now you're going to put them in a group of individuals who can give them ideas for how they can victimize other people. And so without having a framework for being able to reduce those incidences, you're just going to make the situation worse. Okay, well, that's disappointing and that's draining. So what can we do about it? Well, in 2012, New York State recognized that they really needed to come up with some sort of platform, some sort of regulation that would be able to work with families, work with school districts to create some sort of statewide initiative to stop bullying and to reduce the number of incidences that were happening in schools. So in 2012, Governor Patterson signed into law the Dignity for All Students Act. It requires districts and schools to prevent, monitor, and address bullying through various means. What DASA doesn't tell schools is how they do that. So it leaves it up to the schools to create their own anti-bullying policies that address these different avenues. They want to prevent, they want to monitor, and they want to address. So in 2012, when DASA was passed, it established a task force to create statewide anti-bullying policies, training, and curricula for school districts. This curricula was really more of a framework of possibilities for schools to follow, and it did set up a skeleton model of reporting for schools to be able to send incidences up to the state level that schools recognize as being, quote, material incidences. And material incidences are incidences of bullying that have been identified by the DASA coordinator or the person in charge of investigating all bullying incidences within a school district. So that coordinator would then say, yes, this meets our criteria as a bullying incident. And then they would report that up to the state level. There's a number of different issues with that we could get into if we had all day to talk about all of the flaws with DASA, but at least it provides a framework for reporting. Included with DASA is bullying and harassment by students and adults in educational settings or in settings which impact a child's education. And within that is a framework for reporting cyberbullying. It establishes definitions for school property and school functions. So what classifies being on school property? Is it a school bus? Is it a bus stop? Is a school function a school dance? Or is it a football game? Is it an event where a number of students are gathered together, but not necessarily something that's sanctioned by the school district? DASA has been amended a number of different times. Starting in 2015, there was amendments added regarding additional rights for transgender students and gender nonconforming students. And in 2019, it included the Crown Act, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. There are also some added protections for students with disabilities, including students specifically with individualized education plans and 504 plans. So that task force that was established in 2012 was a 20-member task force, and it included advocacy groups, members of the New York State Union of Teachers, administrators, parents, and students. So as family peer advocates and youth peer advocates and other people who are working with families, what you need to know about DASA is that it identifies a school official as a DASA coordinator and requires this coordinator to investigate all reported incidences of bullying, harassment, and discrimination. So as a DASA coordinator, this school official is required to take any incident that's been reported, either anonymously, in person by another individual, or through the school's website and other reporting means, and take that incident and investigate it. Does this actually meet our criteria as an incident of bullying, harassment, or discrimination? DASA also puts into place prohibitions against retaliation for those who report incidences of bullying. So prior to DASA, what a lot of kids were afraid of was that if they reported something, they were going to have repercussions, whether from school administrators or from their peers for identifying these incidences as happening. And what DASA puts in place is that if you see something, you're supposed to say something so that all of these incidences can be addressed. DASA also requires that the coordinator report to the superintendent regarding any data that they're seeing and any trends in bullying that they're seeing within their school districts. In certain instances, it also requires this coordinator to report incidences to law enforcement. It requires that staff, students, and parents receive a copy of the school's policy regarding bullying, harassment, and discrimination. So for a lot of school districts, they bury this somewhere in their school code of conduct or somewhere on their website, which is not always accessible for parents who maybe don't have access to technology or who have lower literacy levels. So again, as people who are working with families and youth, it's important for us to know where we can find this information so that we can direct our families to getting this information and knowing what their rights are. DASA also requires that districts maintain a copy of policies, procedures, and incident reporting on their district's websites. And this reporting procedure has to be easily accessible. So one of the projects that NERCL undertook this year was actually going through our county's websites for the different school districts and evaluating how accessible their DASA coordinators' information was on their websites. Excuse me. And what we found was that about a third of our school districts in Jefferson County had easily accessible DASA information on their websites. And about another third buried that information somewhere within their school's code of conduct. And it took about a good 20 to 30 minutes of dedicated searching on their website to even find information about bullying, let alone finding out who their DASA coordinator was. So it was quite an undertaking on our part to try to figure this information out, but we felt it was important to be able to find that information for our consumers and our families that we're working with, because we're seeing higher incidences of bullying, in particular cyberbullying, with COVID and with so many students accessing education through remote means. So I mentioned earlier in 2019, the DASA was amended with the Crown Act, which stands for Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair. So we were seeing in New York State higher incidences of students who had hairstyles that were either of ethnic or racial origins that were being treated differently, not only by other students, but by administration through their dress code policies that were constantly being in violation of those dress code policies, simply because they chose to wear their hair in a way that honored their ethnic and racial origins. So the Crown Act protects the student's right to wear or treat their hair however they desire, without the threat of racial discrimination or loss of access to school, participation in activities, and inclusion in opportunities both inside and beyond typical classrooms. So the Crown Act really was monumental for students who wear head coverings or who wear their hair based on whatever their racial or ethnic origins are, because it's important to them as part of their identity to be able to do that. So Crown protects them from being harassed by administration and from other officials as a violation of the dress code. Speaking of harassment, I actually put the actual definition of harassment from the New York State Education Department's regulations from 2010 on the slide for you so that you actually have that. Harassment is the creation of a hostile environment by conduct or by verbal threats, intimidation, or abuse that has or would have the effect of unreasonably and substantially interfering with the student's educational performance, opportunities or benefits, or mental, emotional, or physical well-being, or conduct, verbal threats, intimidation, or abuse that reasonably causes or would reasonably be expected to cause a student to fear for his or her physical safety. So harassment is not necessarily the hands-on act of harming someone, but it's the idea of creating this hostile environment through words or through acts of intimidation, which can sometimes be even more emotionally damaging than the physical act of abuse or threatening another person. Bias-based harassment, while it's covered under federal regulations such as Title VI, Title IX, Title II, and the Section 504, as well as the Dear Colleague letter from the U.S. Department of Education in 2010, there still is this idea of harassment and bullying around the idea of a person's race, color, national origin, gender, disability, or religion. So this has been a protected class of citizens for a very long time, and yet students are still being harassed and bullied based on these characteristics. So in 2015, the Dignity Act was amended to include some of these other protected students. So 2015, it was amended to include transgender and gender nonconforming students. So this is a lot of information that I've thrown at you so far, and I know that it's a lot to digest. So you're probably thinking to yourself, wow, this is great. And this is so much information. What the heck do I do with it? How can I help my families? How can I take this information back to my families and help them make sense of this? First and foremost, as family peer advocates and youth peer advocates, we can help by being supportive. The more you know, the more that you can pass on. So knowing where you can get this information through the different resources that we're going to be sharing with you and through knowing who you can contact is going to be your best way to pass on that information. So be supportive and validate what's going on with the individuals that you're supporting. Listen, get the facts, and assess the child's feelings about the situation. Whether it's something that's actually happening to that child or it's something that's perceived to be happening or something that they witnessed, it's affecting that child's mental well-being. And it's important to us to listen to what's going on with that child and validate them and let them know that whatever they're experiencing, it's not their fault. And there's a way that we can help them with that. You want to validate and let them know that it's not their fault, and help the youth or the family report the incident to the school if it hasn't already been done. And as family peer advocates, youth peer advocates, and people who are helping support families, this is one of the most important things that we can do is know what that mechanism is. Look on the school's website and see if there's an easily accessible DASA reporting form. If there's not, know how you can format something through email to report that to the DASA coordinator. Find out who the DASA coordinator is for that particular school district. If there's no easy way to email, how can I help you make a phone call so that we can report this? How can I support you through making that phone call? Provide resources as appropriate. And if it's already been reported, assist the family with following up with the DASA coordinator. So a lot of times what we've heard at NERCL is that I've reported it, but I haven't heard anything. I don't even know what's happened with this. Are they even doing anything? It's perfectly acceptable, and it's a parent's right to follow up and touch base with the DASA coordinator and say, hey, my child reported this incident and I want to know what's been found out. So schools will oftentimes say, well, it involves another student, so I can't release confidential information about that other student. But what they can do is tell you whether they've investigated the incident, whether they found that it meets the criteria as a material incident, and whether that incident is being addressed at a school level. As family peer advocates and youth peer advocates, we can help foster open communication. Maybe what we need to have happen is a meeting between your family that you're supporting and the school administration or the teacher in the building to talk about what the child is experiencing and what kind of things that we can do to address that particular situation. And when all else fails, document, document, document. You can never go wrong by having too much documentation. So anytime a family contacts the school, anytime they report a bullying incident, anytime that they have a conversation with the DASA coordinator, they should be documenting all of these things happening. Because if they feel like the school is not addressing their concerns adequately and the bullying and the harassment are continuing, there are some other steps that they can follow up through, whether that's through the State Education Quality Assurance Office or through the Office of Civil Rights through New York State. There are other avenues of support that are out there to be able to address these incidences if they're not being adequately supported through the school district. So again, I wanted to share some of these resources to you, and I know that you'll be getting a copy of the slides after the presentation is over. But the federal anti-bullying campaign that I mentioned earlier is stopbullying.gov. There's also some great information about bullying through the PACER Center, and that's pacer.org/bullying. There's a link there to the New York State Education Department's Dignity Act page. There's also a specific page related to the Crown Act, so understanding the Crown Act and what the school's obligations are. And as well, we're going to be following up with a few resources for you on bullying that you can give out to parents. One is a brochure on DASA for parents so that parents can understand what their rights are through the process. And if you are working with a student with a disability, there's a great packet of information from the New York State Special Education Task Force that we use here at NERCL quite often, and it's called Bullying and Students with Disabilities. And you will be getting a link to that document so that you can print that off and share that with families. So with that,
oh, Jen, take a breath, grab a glass of water. That was wonderful. So much really, really helpful information, and lots of questions and comments coming into the chat. So I know this is a topic folks are interested in. Before we get into Q&A, yes, the slides will be available. We post them on the CTAC website. If you go to our website, www.ctac.org, you'll see a tab called Upcoming Events, and that's actually our calendar. You can navigate back to today's date once the slides are posted, which will be in about a week, and you'll find the slides, the recording, and also the additional handouts that Jen mentioned. Because you're registered for this webinar, when that's posted, you'll get an email from us saying that it's up. So there was one other question. You throw it in the chat if you had a technical question. So I guess now we'll just go through some of the questions folks had. We have until 2:30 to answer questions. If you need to leave early, Shivi has put in the chat a link to a feedback survey that we'd love to have you complete before you leave this webinar or immediately after it's finished. It's really important for us to give feedback to our presenters. And also it's a great opportunity for you to let us know whether this webinar met your needs and what other topics are important to you. The feedback that we got in the summer really helped shape these 3 webinars that we're doing now. So stay tuned for the Q&A, but if you have to leave, you'll see that link in the chat. And I think it will also pop up when you exit the webinar. So Susan, do you have a question that ready for Jen?
Myself, there I go. Now I'm unmuted. Yeah, there are quite a few questions here, and I'm just going to go down the line and ask them. So the first one is, how are the long-term consequences of bullying the same or similar for girls as boys, or are they the same or similar?
It really just depends on a number of different factors. It's hard to say whether, based on gender, there are differences in the long-term consequences. I think it's less about the gender of the person who is either bullied or is the bully as far as the long-term consequences, and more about the follow-up to the incidences. I think obviously providing some more mental health and natural supports for that particular person increases some positive outcomes for them. And I also feel like how quickly those concerns are addressed at a school level for that particular student plays a role in the outcome for that student. So I don't think it's necessarily based so much on gender per se, although I do know that girls tend to suffer, I hate that word. Girls tend to experience higher incidences of depression and anxiety than their male counterparts from experiencing bullying. But that's really the only statistic that I have. There's a lot more information about the outcomes of bullying from stopbullying.gov. So if you want to check out that website for some more statistical information, I think that would probably answer your question a little bit better.
You know, Jen, somebody made a comment during the webinar about school avoidance and the connection between bullying and school avoidance. And, you know, that seems like a, you know, pretty likely thing. Like, that's what I would do if I was being bullied, is stay home, you know. And it may be that actually that absenteeism is what gets the school's attention because, you know, that's a very concrete thing. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I'll move on to the next question then. Thanks for that question. It seems that indirect bullying is even extra difficult for autistic kids or kids on the autism spectrum who cannot read and understand social cues. And the question is, can you comment on that?
So yeah, that particular question hits home for me because my oldest, Wyatt, is on the autism spectrum. And it's a constant concern of mine that he's being bullied, harassed, or picked on because he doesn't understand those social cues and doesn't understand that when someone is saying something that's not so nice to him, that he's not picking up on that. So I think one of the best ways to address that is through working with school staff on social stories and social scripts, teaching them that there's nice ways to work with your friends and there's not so nice ways to work with your friends. Being able to then take those scenarios and move them from a very generic setting of like, this is a social story and this is very scripted, to helping them move beyond that social scripted story into a more generalized context of everyday life, I think will help that student be able to then understand any incidences that are happening that could be constituted as bullying or harassment. Working with a student with any kind of communication or intellectual delay is really difficult when we're talking about these higher level concepts of bullying and harassment, because it really just depends on the student that you're working with and what their conceptual levels are. So I would start there by working on some sort of social scripting and social stories, see how well they're able to grasp those concepts, and then maybe expand on them from there.
Thanks, Jen. So, and the added, I think, issue around children on the spectrum is that their response often then makes the bully more likely to bully. and even sometimes gets themselves into trouble. So I think that's a great suggestion, the social stories on how to help young people on the spectrum understand what's going on and then craft responses to, to the bully when they're being bullied. So great.
And that particular add-on kind of plays into what Kara Georgi is going to be talking about in a couple of weeks with functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans, because every behavior serves a function. And for kids in particular who don't have the communication ability to be able to say, hey, this kid is picking on me and it's driving me crazy. Looking at the function of the behavior and figuring out why they're doing what they're doing is so important for kids who can't communicate. So, once we combine social stories and social scripts with a targeted behavior plan of when this kid does this, you should react in this way instead of, turning around and hitting the kid or calling them a worse name. So that you get in trouble because you're loud and you don't understand modulating your voice and hiding your behavior from adults who could get you in trouble, which is very common for kids on the spectrum. Teaching them some of those very hidden social skills that other kids pick up on that kids on the spectrum don't necessarily know or are aware of could be very integral parts of a functional behavior assessment and a behavior intervention plan, is kind of that hidden curriculum piece, teaching those kids the very implicit social skills that they're not picking up from their peers.
Great point. Thanks.
Yeah, and Rebecca just commented in with a child on the spectrum, I consistently gave the name of safe people and what or how he can communicate with them. Made a big difference in him feeling safe to go to that person. Yeah.
Absolutely.
A couple of people have commented about that, the importance of finding in the school, someone trusted person who does really get it and who really believes them and who they feel safe with. And, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's power in having someone who you can view as a trusted ally, whether it could be the school janitor, it could be your coach, it could be the lunch lady or your bus driver, somebody that you feel safe and confiding in and being able to tell what's going on and knowing that they are going to believe you and validate what's going on. And most importantly, stand up with you if something is happening that you need to report to a higher official is so comforting to kids to have that safe space.
And I can really see family and youth peer advocates, each in their own way, being really helpful, helping youth themselves, think about who those people might be, both in and outside of school, and also helping parents help their young, folks figure that out as well. Seems like a really important role. Family and youth peer advocates are really good at helping people, kind of reconnect to those natural supports and find, resources that they didn't even know they had. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
So I'm gonna just take a question from a slightly different tack here. Most of the time, the target or bullied child is asked to change their routine at school, such as don't use certain hallways or come into school earlier, instead of addressing the bully and his or her behavior. What can parents do to ensure that the bully is also expected to make changes in their behavior?
Right. And that's one of my personal issues with DASA, is that a lot of times it forces the child who's being harassed or bullied to change what they're doing so that they're no longer a target, but it doesn't address the larger issue of the bullying's happening in the first place. Because if a bully wants to target your child, they will find a way to do so. So I think as parents, knowing that this is not going to be the end all be all to protect your child, and strongly advocating with the school that not only does my child's behavior have to change, but the bully's behavior has to change, and more monitoring needs to be put in place. I think emphasizing those points to the school has to be addressed. And as a parent, if you feel like the school is not listening to you and not addressing your concerns appropriately, you can always contact a family peer advocate to assist you. You can always contact, because this is an education law, you can contact your state education Office of Quality Assurance, which if you go to Google and you type in Office of Quality Assurance for state ed, it'll pop right up, I promise. You can contact a number of different people to address your concerns and let them know this is not enough. And I am not okay with you telling me that my child has to change so that they're no longer a target. And it goes back to my point earlier in the presentation about it needs to be a consistent school-wide approach to changing the way that we deal with bullying and harassment within schools. It's not enough to just say, well, if your kid was less of an easy target, then the bullying would stop. It's not the right approach. It has to be a comprehensive across the board approach. Everybody has to take a role in changing what's happening. I agree.
Great, thank you. And, I think this is all important information for parents, but also important information for family and youth peer advocates, because they can be instrumental in guiding the parent or the youth to know what to do, to know how to move forward if that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
So here's another question that kind of looks at it from the perspective of the bullier. When supporting the bullier, do you have any ideas about how to support parents to balance out lack of consequences and or adding to a child's history of anxiety or depression? So if, we work as parent advocates with parents who have children with different special needs, emotional and otherwise, and sometimes they're the bulliers.
Right.
And how, do you have any suggestions on how to support those parents?
So for those parents, it's a touchy situation because you don't want to come right out and say, your kid should seek out mental health services. But a lot of times kids who are bullying other students are doing so for a specific reason. So as someone who's supporting a parent of a child who's bullying another student, I would first try to get to the bottom of why they're doing that. And to do that, you may have to have them speak with a mental health professional to see if there's some underlying mental health concerns contributing to why they're targeting another person, whether that's because of depression and anxiety, or whether it's because of something that's, a little bit more pervasive, or, something that requires a little bit more intensive treatment. I would also say that a lot of times kids who are bullying other students, it's not so much because parents aren't parenting correctly. There's no right or wrong way to really parent, but maybe it's teaching parents some different strategies in providing consequences for behavior, whether that involves, a different parenting approach, or, instead of taking things away from the child, maybe you teach them about the natural consequences of their poor decisions. So when they make a poor decision, they have to live with that consequence, and guiding the parent and supporting that child through living with the poor consequences of their decisions. So that parenting approach is not always the easiest one to work with parents through. It's a love and logic style approach. But it's something that as family and youth peer advocates, we can look into, talking to parents about, what is it that you feel is missing in this particular puzzle, and how can we build on that, and really look at a parent's strengths and build from there as well. So I hope that answers the question, and if anybody else has something they want to chime in with, yeah, I'm open to other input too.
Yeah, I mean, somebody asked a related question, which is, well, how do you deal with parents who just think this is, kids being kids? And I think, a compassionate response is to say, what we're seeing here is actually really a problem, right? Like what your child is doing, is something that is not good for them and not good for other kids. And how can we get them some help so they don't feel the need to do that?
Right.
I do think that it gets normalized. And that's kind of a natural response, right? Like you don't want to turn it into a big thing, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a big thing. It has to stop. And getting the bully some support, might be a way to help those parents, kind of not see it as punitive, but as something that their child needs as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the slides that you had early in the presentation that spoke about the effect of bullying on all the different people. So there's the person being bullied, the effect on the person who is bullying, which is pretty significant, and then the effect on the bystanders. So, using, as a family peer advocate, using some of those statistics and some of that information, and then, talking to parents about those realities, I think is important in that situation. It's like information from this webinar that you can definitely use to support that. So here's a DASA question. How does a DACA coordinator address bullying by other school officials onto targeted students and families if they're members of the staff? So because it reaches to staff members also. And the comment there is that seems like a huge conflict of interest to have one staff member have to be reporting, so to speak, another staff member for bullying. So how does
Right.
that work? Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of things that are not addressed by DASA, and that unfortunately is one of them. Because there are a lot of scenarios where staff members will witness another staff member either bullying another member of staff or bullying a student within their classroom. And it creates this kind of ethical, dilemma of, if I report this, am I going to have some retaliation? If I report this, is it going to go anywhere? Because, I know that this particular administrator likes that teacher, and they're probably not going to do anything about it because they golf together on the weekends, or their kids are on the same basketball team. So that particular issue is not addressed within DASA. And I don't really have a great answer for that, other than if you feel like the issue is not going to be addressed fairly by going to the DASA coordinator, you can always try to go to the district superintendent to see if your concerns are addressed. Schools are also supposed to have an anonymous reporting mechanism in place as well. So depending on the nature of the incident and the size of the district, you may be able to utilize that anonymous reporting system through the website. But again, there's a lot of other factors that play into that as well. Small districts, people know what's going on within a small district, and how anonymous is it really going to be? It's just, I don't unfortunately have a good answer for that, other than, try talking to the superintendent. And if you're part of a union, maybe speaking to a union representative as a staff member to see what their recommendation would be.
And somebody chatted into, Jen, that it might be helpful for parents who aren't getting, kind of a response, an appropriate response from the school district when a staff member is involved in bullying, to know how to go above the school district. Certainly if their child is in special education, there is a process for that. It's a little trickier if you're not in special education, but there's the school board. And this particular commenter is from New York City, is commenting about how each borough has an office, that's sort of, above, I don't know, above is the right word, but where there may be a person that they could report that to. But, all of the issues you mentioned are real, and it's not necessarily a codified sort of required response. They're just going to have to work the problem.
Right.
We have a couple of questions that center around who to call. And this, I just want to share this one person's specific scenario, which was, who do you contact if a child refuses to go to school due to bullying issues because of being transgender? So they're currently being homeschooled. And the child is also being told by other transgender students in the school to not come back because the school isn't supporting them, but the school is denying any issues and blaming the parent. So, there's a couple questions here, and I see some other ones like, who do you actually call? How do you find out who the DASA person is? And I know you said NERCL took some steps to actually go and identify that person for each school district. So maybe some family peer support organizations want to do that for the districts in your catchment area, make that list. And if you can't find the information, you can ask the school, where is it? And I see that, so Jen, maybe you can respond. And I see Rosalia also has a comment to make.
Sure. So it's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, I know.
Specifically for students who are transgender or gender nonconforming, what I would say is that the New York State Office for Civil Rights has been very helpful for us as an agency in addressing school districts that don't feel that their district is harassing or bullying students that identify in that category. They have provided us as an agency with a lot of guidance and a lot of information on supporting students who are transgender and gender nonconforming. So that's kind of where I would start, is calling the New York State Office for Civil Rights.
We'll get that information into the slides for you.
Please. Yeah. I'll see if I can get you our contact person for that. There's also Disability Rights New York, which is, it's a free legal service provided by New York State. And they have an educational arm of their particular agency. They're not connected with any school district. They're not connected with the government. But they do provide legal services and legal advice and support for people who are experiencing harassment or discrimination at any kind of level. So we've gotten a lot of support from them as well. And I can, again, put that contact information into the slides for anybody who's interested. But if you're not getting what you feel is appropriate from the school, from their DASA coordinator, you can't even find their DASA coordinator because it's buried in page 195 of their school's code of conduct. Definitely reach out for some support, either through a family peer advocate or Office of Civil Rights or Disability Rights New York. They can provide you with a lot of support through that process. But that particular scenario, there's a lot to unpack there. So I would say for that particular scenario, you're going to want to probably contact someone for some additional support.
Thanks, Jen. Rosalia?
Thank you. And thank you, Jen, for a wonderful presentation. I've been listening, and what comes to my mind is that DASA in high school, there's a fine line between DASA and high school and sexual harassment in high school. Some of the things that we feel should be covered under DASA may actually be covered under the district's sexual harassment policies, where there are often specific rights, guidelines, remedies for students with, regardless whether it's related to gender or just simply behavior, just simply a student being what we call bullied because of the way they dress or the skirt somebody may wear. So as advocates, I think it's also important to look on that side of the coin as well, to make sure there are not sexual harassment regulations in your district, as in the case of New York City, to make sure there are not sexual harassment regulations in your district that can be used in high school situation where that line is very often crossed.
It's an excellent point, Rosalia.
Terrific. Julie, I see you're making a specific recommendation in the chat, and if you can send us contact information on, you're recommending a particular resource, that's something we can include and send out to folks as well. So Susan, any last questions before we?
There's actually one that I think is a little bit interesting. It's, what is the best thing you can say to a child, around 10, a 10-year-old in this case, that's being bullied in school? So, we talked a lot about youth on the spectrum and how we can, kind of work with that. But just in general, to a child who's around 10, how would you talk to them about that? What are some suggestions you might have?
So the most important thing for me, coming from a parent's perspective, is letting that child know that they're being bullied, but it's not their fault. A lot of times kids who are being bullied feel like they have been targeted because of something that they've done specifically, or some other thing that's usually beyond their control, and it's invited them to become a target of this bullying. So as a parent, as a family peer advocate, as a youth peer advocate, as anybody supporting a child in this particular scenario, that is first and foremost what I would reiterate to this child, is that this is in no way your fault. You have not invited this to happen to you. You have not created this situation or scenario to fall at your doorstep. So you are not responsible for what another person is doing to you. And then I would validate what they're going through and offer them some ideas about what they can do to address it. For a 10-year-old, maybe having that conversation with them about, I know there's a lot of other kids who have been in situations that are very similar to yours. Would you like to hear what some of those other children have tried when they're in that situation? And kind of offer suggestions, but don't tell them what they should do. Give them some suggestions and some thoughts about things that they can try on their own to address the issue. But always let them know that you're there to support them no matter what they decide to try. So, maybe they decide that they want to talk to their teacher about what's going on. You know what? That's a great idea. After you talk to your teacher, let me know how that turns out for you, and we can talk about what we can do from there. Or, maybe they decide that they want to ignore what's going on. You can try that too. Let's see how that works out. But I think offering some suggestions about what other people have tried in that scenario to address the situation is extremely helpful.
That's great. I mean, there are, it sounds like there are a bunch of ways to address it with the child. And, the thing that really stands out to me about what you said is that it really should be directed initially by the child and supporting that young person in, kind of thinking of a solution and helping them execute it and come back and reevaluate. afterward. So that sounds like great advice. There are a couple of other questions here, but it looks like we're really running out of time. So we can, and I'm just going to assume that we can, give these over to Jen to take a look at, and maybe Jen, if you're interested in, and you can respond, then, we can send that out at some point. Some of them relate to, spaces where kids get bullied in school. Some looking for suggestions about issues that arise in gaming or from gaming. There are a couple of, comments and questions around that. And those are the categories that, really stand out to me that we didn't get to.
Use that survey link that Shivi's been putting in the chat to let us know specifically what topics you're interested in the future, because that can help us come back with, more detail on some of those really specific things that might, where there might be some folks who've really given some thought to, creating safety in the building, or how to deal with cyberbullying or online bullying or bullying within the context of gaming. So Jen, if you could advance the slides,
Sure.
please. So here is Jen's contact information. And I just want to thank you very much. You're getting a lot of love in the chat for such a great presentation. I want to thank you. I know it takes time to put these things together, and NERCL for allowing you to do that. If you happen to be in one of those counties up in the northern part of New York State, you might look NERCL up as a resource for you. Next slide, please. And if you're not, the link on this slide actually will let you know some of the parent training centers and the community parent resource centers that are around the state. These are great resources for you when you have educational issues, including bullying. NERCL and Starbridge and the Long Island Advocacy Center are part of the crew that prepared this webinar series. And they're also great resources depending on where you are in New York State. I'd also like to have Susan just say a word about the Families Together in New York State and the regional parent advisors and the regional youth partners.
So as most of you probably know, Families Together in New York State employs 10 regional parent advisors. There are 2 located in each of the 5 Office of Mental Health regions, and they're available to answer questions, to maybe talk some of this out. They have a bunch of resources that they can recommend. And the regional youth partners, also a part of the Families Together in New York State team, are located also in each of the 5 regions. And they're a great resource for finding youth peer support in your region. So some of the youth, especially if they're being bullied, can really benefit from working with a regional youth partner to empower them to really, do what they need to do in terms of maybe contacting the school or telling a parent or someone at the school that they're having this issue. So that's some of the resources that we have at Families Together in New York State.
Terrific. Thank you, Susan. Next slide, please, Jen. So the links here are to the previous webinars in this series, and also the upcoming webinar that Jen mentioned on functional behavioral assessments and the behavior intervention plans. If you are registered for this webinar, we have registered you for next week's webinar as well. Obviously, it's up to you whether you have time to attend or not, but you are automatically registered. So you should find some information about that in your email. Next slide, please. Here are some other upcoming CTAC events that might be of interest to you. We wanted to just share those with you. And again, you can go to our calendar and take a look at past and present events. And then our last slide is really just thank you for coming today. I know your time is valuable, and I really appreciate everyone's attendance and active participation in the chat. It's nice to know that you're not the only one out there dealing with these issues. And so, sometimes the company in the chat is really part of feeling supported as you take on some of these really difficult challenges that don't have easy solutions. So thank you for that. And with that, I'd like to wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in this series.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.